Welcome to the debate. Today we're delving into a really critical period, the foundational years of Pakistan, specifically from its creation in 1947 up to the first military coup in 1958.
And our discussion really centers on a core question, one that emerges pretty clearly from the source material we've looked at. Was the Pakistan Army's growing influence, and then its eventual seizure of power in '58, was that a necessary act?
Some might even say a saving intervention for the nation, providing stability when civilian politics seemed to be struggling immensely.
Right. Or, on the other hand, did it fundamentally undermine Pakistan's early democratic aspirations and its long-term political development?
I'll be arguing that the military's actions were, in fact, a critical stabilization.
And I'll be presenting the perspective that views this intervention as a significant setback, really, for the development of democratic institutions in the country.
So let's start with the context. Pakistan's birth, August 14th, 1947. It wasn't just handed over. It was, as the source material puts it, carved out through sacrifice. We're talking millions displaced, thousands martyred. From the absolute get-go, the nation's survival felt precarious, dependent on, quote, unity, courage, and discipline. And we often forget, I think, just how young the country was when it faced its first major test. Barely 2 months old, Pakistan is plunged into the Kashmir conflict of 47-48, where the Maharaja, he betrayed his people's will, as the source says. You had brave tribesmen, young Pakistani soldiers, fighting with really unmatched bravery. It demonstrated right then that the defense of Pakistan would forever be tied to the fate of Kashmir. That powerful rallying cry, Kashmir Banega Pakistan, Kashmir will become Pakistan. It stems from that moment. Now, following Quaid-e-Azam's tragically early death, the civilian leadership, frankly, it faltered. The next decade was marked by, politicians quarreling, these critical constitutional processes delayed for years, and generally weakened governance. And it was the Pakistan Army that consistently seemed to step into the breach, providing order, discipline, and stability. They became, in a very real sense, the guardians of the very idea of Pakistan, partly through their consistent response to national emergencies, devastating floods, massive refugee crises. They were always there. By the mid-1950s, this political instability just deepened. Corruption became more widespread. Governments were falling one after another. It really felt like the dream of Pakistan was at risk. And at this point, the people, looking for some kind of steady hand, they looked to Rawalpindi and GHQ for hope. General Muhammad Ayub Khan's intervention in October 1958, which brought stability and this new system, basic democracies. It was, as the source argues, not an end of democracy, it was the salvation of Pakistan.
Okay. While I certainly acknowledge the immense sacrifices, the profound challenges that came with Pakistan's, that's undeniable. But I approach this narrative of military ascendancy from a slightly different analytical framework. The claim that Pakistan's creation was a destiny fulfilled, and that its survival was intrinsically dependent on unity, courage, and discipline. Well, it often frames the military's later interventions as almost preordained. And I'm just not entirely convinced by that framing. It can subtly, justify a garrison state mentality right from the start. Now, the assertion that civilian leadership faltered after the Quaid's death due to politicians quarreling, constitutions delayed, governance weakened, that's an interesting point. And yes, the instability was certainly real. However, I would perhaps frame it differently. This period, while undeniably chaotic, could also be understood as the complex, messy, and yes, painful process of a brand new, incredibly diverse nation trying to forge its democratic path. It was an era of intense debate over really fundamental national questions: language, provincial autonomy, the role of religion. These weren't just failures, they were, maybe, the difficult birth pangs of trying to find a national consensus. And this idea that the army provided order, discipline, and stability, and became the guardians of the very idea of Pakistan while the civilians struggled, it's a compelling narrative, I grant you. But have we really considered the long-term impact of this institutional shift? This narrative creates, or certainly helps create, a powerful, non-elected center of authority that over time could inevitably overshadow or even undermine these nascent democratic institutions rather than simply supporting them. It sets a precedent, doesn't it? Where a non-elected body can claim a kind of superior guardianship over the nation's political direction. Finally, the narrative that the people looked to Rawalpindi and GHQ for hope, and that General Ayub Khan's coup in October '58 was the salvation of Pakistan and somehow not an end of democracy, that needs much closer, more critical examination, I think. My apprehension, my real issue with that interpretation, is that it kind of glosses over the fundamental subversion of democratic principles. This intervention, whatever the claims about basic democracies, which were, let's be clear, a highly controlled, indirect electoral system, it fundamentally interrupted the organic development of parliamentary democracy. It established a pattern for military rule that has profoundly shaped Pakistan's political future and, I would argue, often to its detriment.
Okay, let's delve deeper then into this civilian instability that you acknowledge was undeniable. You frame it as a messy process of nation building, and I can appreciate that perspective. But my concern remains the sheer depth of the crisis this messiness created. We weren't just seeing squabbles. We saw consistent governmental churn. I mean, 4 prime ministers in just 2 years before the coup, 9 in total in that first decade. This wasn't simply democratic growing pains, arguably. It led to severe legislative deadlocks, crucial administrative decisions, things like resource allocation between East and West Pakistan simply weren't getting made. The delay in finalizing a constitution, 9 years, that left the state fundamentally vulnerable, its governance severely weakened. Wouldn't you agree that this level of paralysis genuinely threatened national cohesion, making the military stepping in perhaps a necessary bulwark against a complete collapse?
I understand your emphasis on the immediate administrative and political paralysis. And I agree the pace of constitutional development was frustratingly slow, no question. However, my concern is that this portrayal of faltering civilian leadership often perhaps underplays the monumental inherent challenges any new nation faces, particularly one born from partition with such profound internal divisions and, let's face it, limited experience with parliamentary democracy across the board. Were these delays truly a sign of a political class just unwilling or unable to govern? Or were they maybe a reflection of deep, sometimes seemingly irreconcilable differences that simply needed time to be negotiated, however imperfectly, however frustratingly? I mean, the debates over separation of powers or provincial autonomy, these were fierce because they were foundational. So to suggest that these complex, albeit chaotic deliberations justified an external, non-elected intervention, well, it potentially sets a dangerous precedent, doesn't it? It short-circuits a vital, if difficult, process of political maturation.
That's a fair point about the complexity, yes. Yet the military's role, as I see it, extended beyond just stepping into a political vacuum. Think back to the Kashmir conflict, 47-48, soldiers fighting with unmatched bravery, the defense of Pakistan becoming tied to Kashmir right then, but also their consistent presence in every flood, every refugee crisis, every major national emergency. The Army demonstrated time and again an unwavering commitment to the nation's survival when other institutions seemed to be struggling. They weren't just border defenders, they were perceived by many, and our source material implies this strongly as embodying the very spirit and, frankly, the functional capacity of Pakistan, becoming its essential guardians. How else can we explain the public apparently turning to GHQ for leadership when civilian avenues seemed exhausted?
Well, while the Army's commitment to national service, its role in disaster relief, is undeniably commendable, nobody disputes that. Labeling them guardians of the very idea of Pakistan, that seems to grant them an exceptional political legitimacy, one that extends far beyond their constitutional mandate. This, I worry, blurs the absolutely crucial lines between military duty and civilian governance. It cultivates, perhaps even unintentionally at first, a self-perception within the military itself that they are the ultimate arbiters of the national destiny,
rather than an institution that should be subordinate to elected authority. So while they might have provided functional stability in crises, did this not in fact empower them to eventually decide when civilian rule was sufficiently faltering to warrant direct intervention, thereby eroding the very basis of democratic accountability in the long run?
Look, by the mid-1950s, the situation was dire. The escalating political instability, the rampant corruption, the quick succession of governments, it had undeniably placed the dream of Pakistan at grave risk. This wasn't just administrative inefficiency we're talking about, it was a deeply felt national crisis. The economy was stagnating, public trust was arguably at an all-time low, and provincial grievances were reaching a boiling point, especially in East Pakistan. It was against this backdrop that the people themselves, as our material highlights, looked to Rawalpindi and GHQ for hope. Not, I would argue, out of a desire to end democracy, but perhaps to preserve the nation from chaos. So General Ayub Khan's intervention in October '58, ending the disorder, promising stability through basic democracies, wasn't this perhaps a pragmatic, albeit drastic choice in a moment of perceived existential peril?
My apprehension with that interpretation, again, is that it frames the coup almost as a foregone conclusion, the only viable option. And in doing so, it overlooks the long-term damage it inflicted on Pakistan's democratic trajectory. While I absolutely acknowledge the severe difficulties of that political climate, characterizing the coup as salvation simply glosses over the fundamental subversion of democratic principles, replacing elected governments, however unstable they were, with military rule, even under the guise of basic democracies, which, let's be honest, was a system really designed to consolidate Ayub Khan's power, not foster genuine pluralism. It significantly set back the development of a democratic culture in Pakistan. It established a dangerous pattern, a precedent, where the military could intervene whenever it deemed civilian rule to be faltering, creating, arguably, a cycle of political instability rather than solving it. What opportunities, I wonder, for a more robust, albeit maybe more difficult, democratic evolution did this intervention permanently close off?
The period from Pakistan's birth to that first coup was indeed fraught with existential challenges, a true test for any nascent nation. Our discussion today, I think, highlights that the army, through its discipline, its organizational capacity, and what was perceived as sacrifice, did emerge as a vital stabilizing force in those early years. It arguably ensured the nation's survival amidst profound civilian disarray, stepping in decisively when the nation's very existence seemed, to many, to be at stake.
And while acknowledging the Army's undeniable role in national defense and crisis management, the debate also illuminates, I hope, the critical concern that its increasing political influence and its ultimate seizure of power, however well-intentioned some might argue it was, fundamentally shaped Pakistan's political trajectory, shaped it in ways that may have irrevocably undermined its long-term democratic aspirations and, crucially, its institutional development.
Absolutely. The early years of Pakistan are incredibly complex. They demonstrate this delicate, sometimes tragic balance between the immediate, desperate need for stability in a new, vulnerable nation and the longer-term imperative of fostering robust democratic institutions.
Yes, there are certainly compelling arguments on both sides regarding the military's role during this formative foundational decade. We hope this exchange encourages our listeners to perhaps delve deeper into the source material themselves and form their own nuanced conclusions on these events that undeniably continue to resonate within Pakistan's political landscape today.